Welcome, everyone. A very warm welcome on this rather grey Brussels autumn afternoon. This event is called Women on the Web, Online Empowerment in the COVID-19 Era and Beyond. It's a topic that we thought, especially this year, with all the time that we're spending online and that we will be spending online in the future, that is a topic that we need to address. Not only from a perspective on how we can address gender-based violence online, but also how we can use our solutions to promote women, empower women, and protect them in online spaces, whether it's on social media platforms or in other spaces in the internet. So I'm really, really delighted to be hosting and moderating this discussion today. We have 5 incredible speakers joining us today from different parts of Europe, so including Brussels, but also Ireland, Czech Republic. And we're organizing this discussion today ahead of our Women of Europe Awards, which will be the 5th edition taking place tomorrow, in cooperation with the European Women's Lobby. So we're delighted to continue this cooperation. And I'm also very pleased that we have a speaker, ASHA Allen from the European Women's Lobby, on our debate today. So without much further ado, I would like to present our 5 speakers today. One of our speakers is joining us slightly later, so I'll start with the ones that are already here. So first of all, we have ASHA Allen. I already mentioned her. She is one of the European Women's Lobby's policy and campaigns officers. The European Women's Lobby, for those who may not know, is the largest umbrella organization of women's associations in the EU. So delighted to have you here, ASHA. Next, I'm not quite sure if I'm presenting our speakers in the right order as they appear to you. I think at the bottom we have Lisa Nikandriev, who is Head of Communications and Education at the European Movement Ireland, so an extended colleague of mine over in Dublin. Lisa is involved, obviously, with a lot of the communications of the European Movement Ireland, which is a civil society organization and a member of the European Movement International. She is also engaged and involved in activities, for example, with the organization Shout Out, that delivers workshops in secondary schools across Ireland in tackling LGBTQ+ bullying. And I think we'll have some very interesting views from Lisa, both in sort of from a personal perspective, from a professional one, and from a communications expert that is doing a lot online and a lot of activism and campaigns. Next, we have Johanna NEJEDLOVÁ, who is a co-founder of an organization called Consent. It's a Czech organization working to prevent sexual violence and harassment, especially through education and awareness-raising campaigns. And apart from that, Johanna is also our winner of the European Women of Europe Awards last year, so in 2019. In the category of youth activism. And she's also on the jury of this year's Women of Europe Awards. Delighted to have her back, and also in so many different forms and with so many different hats on. So welcome, Johanna. And last but not least, for now, as we're still waiting for our 5th speaker, is MICHELA PALLADINO. And MICHELA is Public Policy Manager for EU Affairs at Facebook here in Brussels. And it's incredibly important for us also to have Facebook as a social media platform part of this discussion. There's a lot of different angles, obviously, and a lot of different perspectives that we can bring in here when we talk about tackling online violence, abuse, and all the different forms that it may come with, and find solutions together. And I think also our final speaker, who will be joining us soon, Dr. SYLWIA SPUREK, who is a member of the European Parliament, will also offer us a very different view again, but hopefully also complementary and supporting the different efforts that we are here doing together. So as you probably already seen from the title of our event, which is focusing on online empowerment, we decided to focus on this, even though it's linked clearly to online violence and abuse. We would like to, or I at least would like to, have this discussion go in a direction of empowerment. So how can we, by finding solutions to addressing online hate speech and violence against women, how we can then hopefully empower women and protect them at the same time, and how we can also then not only, how this can not only benefit women, but also our society and democracy as such. So maybe I would like to first start with ASHA. ASHA, you work a lot on, and you also represent through the European Women's Lobby a lot of different organizations and women. And as we know, women face increasingly amount of online violence, and women experience also online violence differently in many ways. So maybe first of all, to kick off the discussion and give us some food for thought, what are some of the misconceptions perhaps that you feel are around on online violence, and especially gender-based online violence?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the introduction and for organising this discussion, because it's very important that we talk about this. And I think just to start off, I think one of the main misconceptions, and I think this will help to shape some of the thoughts that we may be having throughout the discussion today, is that online violence is a separate phenomenon or a separate issue to the broader issue of violence against women and girls in Europe. Interestingly, we also almost have a different language to talk about it, right? We talk about trolling, or we talk about cyber harassment, but we need to be clear that the experience of women and girls, particularly those who are politically engaged, who are often directly targeted and more so targeted by this, is just a mirror of the reality that we face in the offline space. And this is just the reality of a continuously sexist and misogynistic world that we continue to unfortunately live in. I think we need to be clear that there are very specific forms of online violence, gender-based violence against women and girls. So this could be image-based sexual abuse, doxing. You've already mentioned sexist hate speech, cyber harassment, and those kind of elements. But we also need to be clear that there are digital tools being used to facilitate other forms of violence against women, such as intimate partner violence, stalking, and in other aspects as well. So the misconception there is that it can just be a discussion between people where it turns into nasty comments online, or women may be sent terrible comments online. It's much, much broader than that, and it definitely needs to be seen within the scope of the continuum of violence against women and girls. For politically engaged women specifically, I think there's been increased recognition of how prominent the issue is for them, but not necessarily how much it is. Women are 27 times more likely to experience harassment online, and if you're a Black woman specifically, you're 84% more likely to receive an abusive tweet, for example. So what we need to do is understand the scope. I think the scope of it can be misconceptualized sometimes, and the lack of the holistic analysis around it is also misconceptualized. But I think in this time of COVID-19, it's become much more relevant as we spend more time at our screens. It's clearly higher on the political agenda at this moment in time. So I think there's many different aspects that we can talk about in terms of the misconceptions, but those are the two most prominent ones, I would say, at this moment in time. And we can go into the elements of that as we continue the discussion.
Thanks, Asha. Just a quick question. You mentioned doxing. I know what it means because I Googled it beforehand, but I'm not sure everyone watching knows what it is. And also, yes, I feel that that's fine. I'm here to ask the silly questions. But I'm also thinking there's probably a lot of forms of online violence that we don't realize are actually violence online. So doxing, but also maybe could you? Oh, there's a bit of background noise. I'm not sure from where. Yep, I think it's okay. So apart from doxing, are there a few sort of forms of online violence that you would like to maybe point out here that we should recognize and also think of in our discussion, but also generally?
Yeah, sure. So I'll explain doxing first. So doxing is the act of taking someone's personal information and disseminating it online. And this tends to happen to specifically politically engaged women, whether they are politicians, journalists, human rights defenders. And it's actually a very prominent example of understanding that what happens in the online space filters into the offline space, and that the line is actually quite blurred. Because what happens when people are doxed and their information is disseminated is that, they may experience some sort of physical harassment, and they may be forced to engage security firms and things to protect their identities. So it goes a lot further. One of the other aspects I think that comes up quite often is image-based sexual abuse. This is more commonly referred to as revenge porn, but this goes back to the topic we talked about on language, right? In terms of the language we use around the experiences of women online. And there has been progress to try and combat this specifically, but it remains specifically quite prominent in the European space. Online stalking is extremely prominent, and what we've seen is that in cases of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, this has been recognised as one of the forms of control and psychological violence that is increasingly being experienced by victims and survivors of this specifically. But of course, we can't have this conversation without talking about sexist hate speech. And this includes, the death threats, the threats of rape, the threats of violence towards women. And again, just to reiterate that politically engaged women politicians receive this on a much more exponential rate. But it is being experienced by all women and girls online, a majority of women and girls in the online space.
Okay, thank you. I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to move on to Lisa next. Lisa, working for a civil society organization, perhaps you have a similar perspective, perhaps also a different perspective, also from a different member state. Also, the European Movement Ireland does maybe slightly different work than the European Women's Lobby, and you might experience also, and from a personal perspective, you might experience online violence differently. So are there any points that you recognize in what ASHA said, or are there sort of some other views that you have on how you perceive sort of the current developments and trends in online violence, especially targeted at women?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the experiences of women, based on their race, based on their sexuality, based on their socioeconomic standing, they're going to vary from member state to member state, and with people's different sort of the factors that the intersectional factors that come into their experience of women's rights and equality. But I mean, there's so much of it that is common and that we can work together. This is something we can really work together on across Europe and indeed across the globe. Because there are so many common factors here. Here in Ireland, a friend, that I spoke to when I was sort of preparing to speak today, women of colour here in Ireland who were born in Ireland, the experiences that they have are very different to the experiences I have. The experiences I have as a queer woman online are very different to the experiences my cis and straight friends have online. And what we see through European Movement Ireland with our female CEO, who's now the Vice President of European Movement International too. And, when we engage with women in society in Ireland, they'll be different to the experiences, for example, that I have with my organisation Shoutouts that I work with on LGBT stuff. So there are kind of lots of common threads. And I think one massive common thing that I think we'll all recognise today is the increase and the sort of overwhelming increase of this kind of violence and this as an issue in our societies, and as a major issue for us as Europeans and as civil society organisations that we have to tackle. But this is on the increase overwhelmingly across Europe. During the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, we've all been online more. We know that minority communities and vulnerable people are always subject to more extremes during a time like this. So, we see more, for example, against queer women from my work at Shoutout online, more of this kind of online abuse. In Ireland, interestingly, there was a study recently done by the National University of Ireland, Galway, on women in political life in Ireland. And I wanted to highlight it because the findings were really quite incredible. Sort of that at least 1 in 5 of the women who are involved in politics in Ireland who worked on this survey had experienced online abuse or hate, which is actually quite a low figure when we compare it to maybe other studies. But what really shocked me was that 1 in 5, as I say, had experienced this, but 59% of our local female councillors had experienced this extreme hate online. And when we think about women's representation in politics, and that's something that's important to us in European Movement Ireland as a civil society organisation, that equality and diversity is represented, I think it's important that women aren't afraid to go into politics because of factors like this, that they aren't pushed away from it because they know that this is an awful factor of the job, that they may experience this kind of hate. Our Lord Mayor, Hazel Chu, has been, you know, quite vocative recently about how she has experienced serious levels of online hate that, of course, transfers to real life too. She's a Chinese American woman, or Chinese Irish woman, excuse me, and she has experienced really awful racial and sexist abuse online. So lots of issues that are kind of coming to my head, and I'm sure we'll tease out further. But I think, you know, I'd recognise a lot of what was said, but equally we each have to kind of look at our own member states and look at our national government's actions on these things, as well as how we can work together in solidarity across Europe to prevent these things that are very much global issues and very much on the rise, unfortunately.
Thanks, Lisa. I think you've made some important points there. The political participation that is affected, obviously, by online violence, and that is a global issue. And if it's a global issue, it's definitely a European issue. It's not going to stop at the border. So that makes sense. You know, we're talking about how we can address this at the European level. Before I move on to get some first comments from our next speaker, Johanna, I'm just going to quickly introduce our final speaker who is joining us, Dr. SYLWIA SPUREK, who is a member of the European Parliament. Hi, Sylvia. I think you're still on mute, but you can, if you like, stay. Yep, you can stay unmuted for the rest of the event. Welcome. I'll do a quick introduction for you, as I did for the others. So, Sylvia, you are a member of the European Parliament from Poland. You are in the group of the Greens, and you're also involved in the two committees of the Parliament, which would be the one dealing with women's rights and gender equality, and the one dealing with civil liberties, justice and home affairs. Both committees and their work are very crucial for also our discussion today, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this issue, on tackling online violence, gender-based violence, and empowering women. First, I'll move on to Johanna and MICHELA, and then maybe at the end, you can give us our first sort of remarks. I'll ask a question, then we get going in the discussion, and hopefully at the end, we'll have some sort of ideas on how we can do better together and how we can work better together on this issue. So, Johanna, let me move on to you. First of all, I was wondering, because Consent, your organization, that you are most welcome to also present a bit here in your work, which was, I think, co-founded a few years ago. You use awareness campaigns and kind of myth-busting attempts to address sexual violence and harassment. What kind of myths are there around sexual violence, whether it's in Czech Republic or in Europe, and especially online violence? How do you address this, and what do you think we have to address at the moment? What's the most urgent thing we need to talk about?
Thank you for having me there. Hi. I think that the situation is mostly the same all around Europe, but somewhere the stereotypes and myths are broadened and lots of more people believes into them, and somewhere it started to disappear. In Czech Republic, I think the biggest problem is that 58% of Czech people believes that the person, the victim of sexual violence or abuse, is partly responsible for what happened to them. And that's actually the thing which started our activity, and it was the most crucial information we used to start our campaigns. Later, we decided to combat those myths, which are mostly about how does the regular rape looks like. Most of the people in Czech Republic believes that the rapes happen somewhere in dark corner of the park during the night, but the truth is that most of the rapes happens within intimate partnership, or it's done by someone who the survivor or the victim knew, like husband, not a husband is the 50%, but the or a teacher or a boss, somebody like this. And we in Consent, we believe that to combat the sexual violence, we need to open up the discussion about it and to explain really to people what is it, and that it is like every sexual activity without consent of the another person, and that it's harmful. Right now, we have in Consent new project, which is focused actually on gender-based cyber violence. And during this project, we discovered that Czech society is full of myths about gender-based cyber violence also. And I think that the biggest myth is, again, committed to victim blaming related to, for example, image abuse. We have lots of trainings in schools for kids about safetyness on internet, but most of them are built up on how to protect yourself. And the crucial is, like, it's never okay to send any picture to somebody else, because then if you do so and somebody else reveals it or send it to other person, then you are the silly one who did it. And I think that's one of the new challenges we need to fight.
Mm-hmm. And just a question too, because do you find also that then, I mean, I think numbers, we don't have enough data, I think, on online violence, but tendencies show that younger women receive or are more at risk to receive online violence. And maybe ASHA, you can also confirm. Is this also where you see the need to kind of address this issue at a young level, and who do you try and reach then also with your campaigns?
Definitely, to do peer programs on that on this issue. It means that the peers are going to schools and are holding workshops on the topic of gender-based cyber violence. But we believe that it's crucial to activate the bystanders of this form of violence to be active, because most of the people are really they are not committing this kind of crimes, but they are silent if they see it. And I think to fight it, we need to convince them to not to be blind or to stand up for the victims.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, and I think probably online violence is a particular form where a lot of people are silent, and it's very hard to miss certain forms of violence. We turn a blind eye on it, even though we spend so much time online. And that's also one question I had for you, Michela, to kind of kick off, because our event is also focusing on online empowerment in the COVID-19 area. And working for Facebook, how do you feel? What is the impact of the pandemic so far on online violence against women? And in that sort of context, what do you find especially worrisome at the moment when you take a look at sort of the violence that women face online?
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you so much to European Movement International and European Women's Lobby for having me to represent Facebook on this panel. So first of all, what I'd like to say is just that obviously, as much more eloquently explained by the previous speaker, gender-based violence is very pervasive in the online space. It takes really all sort of different forms, and as ASHA I think mentioned at the beginning, is really a continuation of what happens in the offline world, and in a lot of instances it kind of mirrors that. With regards to Facebook, we are a very large platform. We have almost 3 billion users. So as you can imagine, we see all sort of behaviors being, all sort of abusive behaviors as well being perpetuated, and all sort of abuses being perpetuated. But our ambition as a platform is to provide our users and the people online with a positive experience, with a meaningful experience, with opportunities to take advantage of the digital transformation. And in particular, we want women to be able to take this opportunity and just grow their business, connect, and raise awareness for causes that they care about. For this reason, we are aware that we need to provide, and we're responsible to provide, a safe space for them to be able to thrive, and we are very committed to that. It's challenging at times because, as you can imagine, the scale of the company and of the reach is so broad, and also the global diversity that is represented doesn't really make it for an easy task. But we're committed to that. And we have a holistic approach to that, which spans from having a global set of policies that that define what's allowed and what's not allowed on the platform, to obviously being a tech company, to the technology, to on one hand help us enforce our policies at the scale that we operate, and on the other hand to develop tools that help users be in control of their experience so that they're able to put boundaries on what makes them feel comfortable while surfing our platform. For victims in the specific, we have a lot of resources and at their disposals, including, and this links to what you were asking, Vanessa, about COVID-19. For example, one of the latest things, which was linked to the fact that we observed, also thanks to all the experts that have been flagging that to us, this spike of domestic violence. We've been working in the specific with UN Women and with the US National Network to End Domestic Violence to develop on one end, part of our COVID-19 help center, which include tips for women or others that are experiencing domestic violence, but also friends. So that's also kind of a bit the network around people that are victim of this kind of abuse. Tips on how to ensure safety, who to contact. We are putting together a directory of hotlines, and also a group of Facebook engineers have volunteered pro bono to create a specific tool that helps victims connect directly to the hotlines at local and national level to seek and get support in case of when they find themselves in situations of domestic abuse. All of this is obviously possible and powered by our partnerships with safety organizations. We are very happy to be able to collaborate with over 400 organizations at global level. Some of them sit in our safety advisory boards. And these partnerships is essential for us because ultimately the knowledge and the expertise about this phenomenon, this abuse, is really with those that work on the field, that are closer to the victim, in some cases closer to the perpetrators, or just academics that study the phenomenon. And through these partnerships, we are able to learn about the different situations and the different abuses that are being perpetuated, and also discuss potential solutions. So we rely enormously on these partnerships, and we're very happy that we are able to rely on organizations in this sense. I will stop for this now, but I'm happy to go back on anything.
Thank you, Michela. Sylwia, I was wondering, so we've heard a lot of different perspectives, and clearly there is, as Michela was saying, a spike in not only domestic violence, but violence online, and women experience this very differently. There's different perspectives also from different member states. So from your perspective, whether it's in Poland or in the EU, across member states, how do you see these worrisome developments? Is there something particular that you would like to address in particular as an MEP? And yeah, if there's anything that you that the previous speakers haven't touched upon yet, feel free to highlight.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this event. I'm really happy that more and more people is aware that online hate speech affects all users, but hate speech targeting women and that targeting men are not the same. And I've been dealing with women's human rights for 21 years now, and it was not so obvious in the past. I was a lawyer in NGOs. I was a legislator drafting the first law on counteracting domestic violence for Polish government in 2003. I was an academic, and my PhD thesis concerned the isolation of the perpetrator of domestic violence from the victim, which is especially now a crucial thing to do. Because we need to make victims of domestic violence during COVID-19 safe in their own homes. And I was also coordinating the process of ratification of Istanbul Convention by Poland in 2015. And I remember a crucial report of Polish Helsinki Foundation of 2017 about cyber violence against women, towards women. And it was a shock for many people that such thing existed. And it's different that cyber violence against men. And that's why this year I organized a roundtable. I've been organizing roundtables since I gained the mandate of MEP in 2019, and the third roundtable of this events concerned cyber violence against women. Experts, activists, NGOs were invited for this roundtable, and we talked about forms and characteristics of online violence, and as well as strategies and recommendations. And of course, we can talk about persecution of the offenders. We can talk about raising awareness. But what was actually underlined during this roundtable was the key role played by online platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, because they need to clearly draw the line between hate speech and the freedom of speech. These are totally two different things, and the platforms should implement solutions allowing them to effectively moderate all comments, as well as stipulate clear procedures on combating cyber violence. And these procedures should be friendly to persons reporting the cases of violence. What I mean is the online platforms should start to take their responsibility for hate speech the users face. But we talked also about recommendations of legislation nature. I'm a lawyer, so I think these are very crucial ones. And of course, at EU level, it is necessary to formulate the definition of cyber violence. And the European Union obviously should ratify the Istanbul Convention. I'm a shadow rapporteur on this file in the FAM committee. But we need also to include gender-based violence into the catalogue of EU recognized crimes in the treaty. And the last thing, it's very important to recognize in this EU Code of Conduct of counteracting illegal hate speech online that also Facebook signed a few years ago, the specific nature of cyber violence against women. And we need to also increase the effectiveness of this code of conduct, because I think, you know, we all face hate speech in the internet, unfortunately, and women that are active in social media face it even more, and it affects actresses, businesswomen, women that are journalists, human rights activists, and politicians. But we need to make the internet a safe space for every woman. And I think the key role that online platforms can play is really crucial, and their responsibility for hate speech comments and so on. So I'm really glad that we are talking about cyber violence in a such broad group today.
Thank you, Sylwia. And I was also thinking, I mean, we have a great diversity today in our speakers, but even adding, you know, speakers from outside the EU would even broaden the perspective even more, because I think there's a lot of also good solutions outside of it. We sometimes like to focus on Europe too much, and then we forget there's the rest of the world. But there were a lot of interesting points in all of your initial remarks, and there's a lot of things that you maybe also want to touch upon. Sylwia, you mentioned the current EU efforts and also your efforts in promoting this. I see ASHA nodding. I was also wondering, ASHA, if you could also maybe share your perspective or the European Women's Lobby's perspective on the importance of the Istanbul Convention that Sylwia touched upon. If you want to bring in any other views on other possible legislation at the EU level. And then I'd also like to get in views from MICHELA, Lisa and JOHANNA on obviously the role of social media platforms, but also perhaps the role of education and activism. Maybe ASHA, if you...
Yes, of course. Yes, I'd be happy to support, and actually, MEP SPUREK outlined some of our key requests and demands and recommendations to the European Union on what needs to be done here. To touch on the Istanbul Convention, first of all, it is the most comprehensive framework that we have internationally at this stage to combat violence against women and girls and domestic violence. And it does also emphasize the need for prevention as well as protection, so not just after the fact, but also ensuring that perpetrators are prosecuted and that women are able to seek the justice that they do if they're experiencing violence. But in the last 2 years, we are seeing more legislative precedents. So we've seen 2 cases in the European Court of Human Rights where they've recognized the online dimension when it comes to the perpetration of intimate partner violence. So we're seeing an increasing understanding of how these existing legal mechanisms can also be understood and interpreted, to understand how the online dimension comes into the perpetration of violence against women and domestic violence. So we've been calling for the EU to ratify the Istanbul Convention. It's signed, so gave the intention to ratify in 2017, and unfortunately we are still waiting for this to progress. And we also called on all EU member states to do so. We have had 21 do this, but we are still awaiting for some member states to do this as well. But what we would call for is that the EU actually uses this opportunity. This discussion is now high on the political agenda. I think for several of us on this panel, we've been talking about this more and more. And as you mentioned earlier, with the onset of the COVID pandemic and our exposure to the online space more, whether it was for work or education or for any of the other reasons that we had to engage in more Zoom calls or being in the online space, I think that we are now at a point in the discussion where we have recognized the issue. We understand it. We understand the gender dimension, how much more this disproportionately impacts women and how much more it disproportionately impacts women with intersecting identities. So I think for us, it's an opportunity for the EU to go even further than that. So we would support the calls of the European Parliament and our civil society colleagues that the EU needs to go even further. So we would call for a comprehensive EU legal framework and action plan to combat all forms of violence against women and girls, which includes online violence. And this is both in terms of recognizing the online dimension in the perpetration of violence and facilitation of violence against women, but also specific forms that we've mentioned, whether it's image-based sexual abuse or doxing or specific forms of sexist hate speech as well. We support the call, as mentioned by MEP SPUREK, for the recognition of violence against women as an EU crime, and there has been discussion about this from what we understand from the speeches of Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen, for example, in regards to moving this particularly forward. And what we would also call for is harmonization between the different EU frameworks. We have something called the Victims' Rights Directive. You mentioned the Code of Conduct hate speech. And no, this is not a legally binding in piece, it's a political piece. And what we would ask for is those different pieces to speak to each other to ensure that women and girls across Europe have the ability to have equal levels of protection, of prevention, and equal levels of access to justice when they are experiencing this. So this is what we would call for from an EU perspective. But of course, this issue includes a lot of different stakeholders. And I'm actually really glad, of course, that you've brought together civil society, platforms, politicians, and experts to be able to talk about this, because for us, those are the key stakeholders who need to be involved in this particular situation. It can't be left solely to one particular stakeholder to be able to do something about this, because there needs to be that exchange of expertise. Women's civil society maintain the feminist analysis, intersectional analysis, and the broader analysis to be able to flag the issues, as MICHELA was saying, working with some of their partners, being able to flag those issues when they arise and that may not have been foreseen originally, or to be able to speak with politicians and say, this is what is happening on the ground. It was our observatory on violence against women, a formation of 40 experts from across Europe who inform us about the burning issues, that was telling us back in 2015, we need to be very conscious of this growing case of online violence and what's happening there. So this is what we would say in regards to what we would call for. But of course, we can go more into the discussion, and it would be great to hear from the colleagues as well on support for this.
MICHELA, before I move to you, because there might be a few points that we would also like to sort of hear your views, I was wondering, Lisa and Johanna, are there any points here that when you think sort of what women but also civil society would need from the EU and from social media platforms to give you more of a voice in this debate? Because obviously there's so much, there's lack of data, first of all, but then was also the willingness that I can tell from all of you to improve the situation. So how would you maybe like to be more involved, and what would you expect from some of these pieces of legislation, or as the Code of Conduct, different tools that we have at the European level to improve? I don't know, Lisa, or if you would go first, otherwise Johanna.
Yeah, Johanna may have more to say than me on this, but I suppose like a practical sort of example that I can give from us in European Movement Ireland is that we do some work with Facebook here in Ireland. So drawing on some of what MICHELA said, I suppose Facebook in Ireland works with civil society organisations like ourselves to kind of garner this knowledge and to ensure that they know what the climate is out there. And I know they've done some recent surveys of women and women's experiences online, more globally, and some of that information was sort of fed back to us from Facebook. And I think that's really important, that obviously listening to women and hearing what women's experiences are online, and in particular women who are experiencing abuse online. And we all need to, I think this is the point where social media is at that point of almost spiraling to become something so huge, as well. Maybe it already has, but it's becoming more and more, and we have to think more broadly on social media, that it's not just Facebook and Twitter, it's messaging apps like WhatsApp, it's dating apps, and what are women's experiences across those. And as we say, the intersectional variance then for women, how does a bisexual woman experience a dating app? How does a Black woman in Ireland experience Facebook that's different to their counterparts? So we need to gain knowledge at this point. I think we need to listen to women, we need to survey women regularly, consistently, in particular during a time like this pandemic. Things like Brexit, even, how are women experiencing things differently during the Brexit process? Has that changed? I read some of that interestingly from MPs in the UK recently. So we really need to gain that knowledge and survey women and listen to women, and I think work as closely as we can as civil society organisations with the social media platforms to be sure that we're all sort of singing from the same hymn book, as we say in Ireland, and supporting women as best we can. And the only way we can support is if we know what the experience is, if we know what we can best do to support them, and that will really vary across, as I say, the different intersectional variants. So we really need to gain a lot of knowledge at this point, because I don't think we know enough. Even when I was sort of preparing for today, I spoke to women in leadership here in Ireland. I spoke to, as I say, women of color, women with different sexualities, to see was there a variant. And even they hadn't reflected as much themselves. And they said, oh yeah, when I think about it, actually I did, this person did target me based on my race or based on my gender. So we need to reflect as women on what we're experiencing, what's right, what's wrong. I know Eurofound here in Ireland did surveys and were shocked to see that some of the most sort of prevalent examples of abuse against women was from Scandinavian countries, which was something they didn't expect. And this was because there had been recent educational programs in those countries to talk to women about what's acceptable and what's not, to talk to them about consent, to talk to them about online hate against women. So they were hyper aware and educated and, up to speed on what was acceptable, what wasn't. And therefore, they reported higher than other countries because they were, educated. So I think education is huge, and listening to women and talking to women consistently and working together, between civil society and social media platforms and the institutions, of course.
Thanks, Lisa. Those were some very important points. And I agree that we sometimes, also as women, need to be more aware of some of these threats, and that we sometimes don't process and think about them. And talking, I think, is already helping. But I think in the end, we can talk as much as we like. If we don't address the issues sooner rather than later, it's not going to get better by itself. I don't know, Johanna, if you want to step in here, if there's some points on that, and then I would also check with MICHELA if there are any points that she would like to pick up on. But in terms of the awareness raising, the risks that women face, and also the cooperation part, I would be interested to hear what you think about that. And maybe at this point, I'm getting reminded that I should also invite our viewers to send over any questions, which they can do via the platform that they will be watching, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. We are live streaming everywhere, and there's always a comment section. So feel free to ask your questions or send your comments. Johanna, please.
Yeah, I really agree with Lisa, and I believe that also some awareness-raising campaigns could help a lot, because there's lots of people who experiences gender-based cyber violence, but they don't know how to name it. They don't recognize it as gender-based cyber violence, and they also don't know that they can fight against it, or they can complain about it, or they don't know that it's not their fault. So I believe that we need to spread awareness about what's going on online medias and social medias, and that it's not okay. And I think it should be responsible of the social platforms, because from my point of view, it's kind of paradox that my organization is doing some campaigns about online violence, which is happening on the social network, and I have to pay for the advertisement to the social platform. Where is it actually happening? It doesn't make sense so much, I think.
MICHELA, so there's obviously a lot of perspectives, and then there's a lot of responsibility that Facebook and also other social media platforms and online platforms hold. At the same time, we see that it's a joint effort that we have to address, and there's different sort of ways we can help. But what do you think on these points, and what would you also hope from the EU in able to sort of promote cooperation that can also help Facebook take on these responsibilities and address the issue better? Because clearly there's so much content that the users using these platforms are posting that is considered illegal or harmful content. How would you hope to better address this, considering all the other points made?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think there was I picked up on so many elements of what my fellow panelists were saying. I think, well, starting from the last thing that you mentioned, Vanessa, on what we would like to see maybe from the EU that would help us do a better job. I think there's a lot of opportunities that are coming our way. Dr. SPUREK mentioned a few of them. I mean, starting from the voluntary code of conduct against illegal hate speech is already quite an established mechanism. It's true, it's voluntary, it's not legally binding, but it's nevertheless it showed it's shown his value. It's been a really great instrument. I think platforms and Facebook and Instagram have shown also how much they've progressed over the years on how they tackle illegal hate speech online, also thanks to this to the commitment to the code of conduct, and we maintain the same level of commitment to this day. But also we see a lot of different opportunities in upcoming EU legislation. I mean, there were mentions of the expansion of the list of EU hate crimes, but we also, obviously, the Digital Services Act comes to mind, which is going to be launched in a couple of weeks or next week. Now I forgot what day it is today. And there is a big opportunity to actually establish this EU framework for content moderation. And I think that from Facebook's perspective, we are a global company. We operate at a scale. That is also why we have to, we have these community standards which are beyond what the different legal systems are in place, and they go beyond sometimes legislation because they need to reflect the global diversity of the community that we serve. But we obviously also want to operate in compliance with the law, and obviously we find that the fragmentation that we are noticing in member state level with regards to addressing specific forms of violence, including violence against women, including violence against other vulnerable categories like LGBTQ community, for example, we would prefer and we think that it would be more efficient if the EU would step in, and there would be a possibility for an EU-wide definitions of a different kind of abuses, whether it's content that is then ultimately decided to be legal throughout the EU, or whether it's content that is harmful. We still are supportive of a framework that would help us better tackle that. This being said, I think we are very much aware. I think that this is a collective effort. So going back to what others were saying around the need for every actor involved in this space to come together, to share best practice, to learn from each other. Because of course, I mean, as I was saying at the very beginning in my first intervention, the value that we see in talking to experts, NGOs, etc., is the fact that they bring us their expertise. We learn more. We don't know everything, so we find these exchanges very valuable. And if there is a role for the EU as well, maybe to convene, maybe that's also something to further consider. There will be more to say around, for example, what ASHA and the others actually were saying around the importance of prevention, the importance of education. There was a lot of talks around the importance of educating women, but I think also there's a lot that needs to be done to educate men, to move beyond the traditional misogynist view of the role of women in society. And that's also something that is that can be done through education, through awareness raising. And we are very we want to be part of this conversation. We want to be part of the solution. We want to support those that want to raise awareness. I think an example is the fact that this year, actually, we are in the middle of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and Facebook is behind this campaign, which is running for the duration of the 16 days. And we are organizing some events ourselves. We are powering and supporting some events that partners, including European Movement International, are organizing. And we are trying to raise awareness by posting videos every single day. And one of those is actually JOHANNA, which will be in the next few days, that share their perspective on the issue of gender-based violence, that propose solution, or that just flag the importance of coming together, calling on the EU to step in and help out in the discussion. So we are very much there. We want to be part of the discussion. We want to be part of the solution. Vanessa, I think you're mute.
I was thinking before, and I will probably have to remind you all to unmute yourself, and then it happened to me. So I was just saying, first of all, I'll remind again our viewers that they can send in questions and comments. And then I believe that SYLWIA would maybe like to comment on some of the points made, either by MICHELA or other panelists. And then if anyone else wants to come in, don't hesitate. And yeah, SYLWIA.
A very brief point. I totally agree with Ms. MICHELA Palladino about the education, the need of education of men, because I think we are all sick and tired of listening how to educate women not to be raped, not to become a domestic violence victim, not to face sexual harassment at work. We need to stop educate women. We need to start educate men how not to rape, how not to sexual abuse women, how not to use cyber violence against women. And this is, I think, a crucial point, because we all have the same, I think, experiences with education. We've been educated. We need to be afraid of some places, some people. We need to stop thinking this way. We need to start to educate men now. So yeah, that's it.
I think, I don't know, perhaps Lisa and Johanna, I know that you both work on education in this aspect. If there's anything you would like to add on that, and then I will bring in a question that we have received from one of our viewers after that.
I think it's definitely crucial to educate men, but what I always say is that we can't educate only men, because, like, I'm a feminist and I believe that one day there will be like equality between men and women. And as we know that the violence on women is caused by the inequality, and it's caused not by some lunatics, but by some people who are misusing their power. So if I look at it and I see the future when lots of women will also have the power, then they could become the perpetrators of the violence. So that's why I believe that if we go to schools and do the education and prevention on this issue, we should both educate the same women and men, or girls and boys, on how to not to become the perpetrators. Because if we educate them how not to become the perpetrators, we also educate the girls that if they become victims, it's not their fault, and all this other stuff. So I think
yeah, I'd agree, and I'd certainly agree with Dr. SPUREK. I think, you know, we've all grown up with this, and any of the women who are watching, we've grown up with these rules and, you know, these frameworks that we all have to mold into. And sometimes I think our you know, male friends don't even understand that we take a different route when we walk home for our safety. We, you know, I heard somebody speaking once, a male comedian, Irish comedian, speaking about how he was sitting watching the sunset on the way home from a big party pre-pandemic, and he was saying, I realized at that point that my female friend couldn't sit and watch the sunrise at like 5 a.m. because it wouldn't be safe for her. So she misses out on that experience, and we miss out on all these experiences. And I would strongly agree that we need to educate men more, because we are constantly educating women. We raise our women, our young women, with these rules in the same way that people of color, we see in the States now, a lot of people of color saying, I have to tell my child to be careful of the police. You know, there's all this education that's happening that really there needs to be education on the other side more so. Something that I didn't mention earlier, and as we were talking about Facebook and Facebook ads, it came to me during Europe Week. Of course, Vanessa, my colleague Christian in European Movement International, and many of us working in communications in the European Movement International network ran a campaign with a variety of issues, you know, climate change, gender equality, all of these things, and we shared a number of Facebook ads. What really shocked us in European Movement Ireland, and I'll be honest, like, we're quite privileged, you know, white people working on European issues in a country that's hugely supportive of the EU. We hadn't experienced this kind of vitriol until the moment that we shared a video containing 2 minutes each, if not less, from Greta Thunberg. That was the one video that got over 80 comments when the other videos got maximum 4 comments. And the vitriol against this child, a young woman who was 14 at the time that we were sharing these videos, was incredible. The language that we used, the defamatory language, and it was certainly misogyny. And people might say, oh, is it because she's speaking about climate change? But no, this is a young woman who's loud, who's, you know, we've heard about nasty women from very high up politicians. And it's this idea of just because she's a woman with a voice, she's being attacked. And we need to tackle that, and we really need to think ourselves about what our voices are as women online, and be as loud and bold as we want, and not feel that we have to be something different to men, and educate men in that regard too. I think our voices online as women can be different to men's, and I think that's because, like in real life, when we avoid that lane on the way home, we sometimes avoid confrontation online because we know we'll get abuse. We talked earlier about women leaving politics because of online hate. We need to be sure that we're not pushing women out of these spaces because of a lack of education, conversation, and, as you said, Vanessa, action.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks also for the very concrete examples, and also bringing in your work and the work of the European Movement International. ASHA, do you have thoughts or any further comments on this before I drag us back to EU legislation talk, because we have one question on that?
Yeah, of course. And again, just really supporting what our colleagues have said on the panel here. I think what we are all saying is that we need to bring down the patriarchy, which is kind of what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a system that perpetuates gender stereotypes and that negatively impacts on women and girls, men and boys. The Istanbul Convention picks up on this specifically, right, in regards to the need to have education, to end gender stereotypes, and that to go through the entire life cycle. For the European Women's Lobby, we conducted we have our Her Net, Her Rights project, which was initially a report, and we turned that into a training during the European elections campaign. And one of the things that I found during one of the trainings I gave was just the realization that digital literacy doesn't necessarily equal an understanding of digital citizenship. So the concept of not recognizing the unconscious biases or how specific forms of online violence against women are perpetrated. So interestingly, in regards to the differences between experiences of male politicians and women politicians, of course, male politicians experience violence and hate speech, but the question then was raised, why does the violence that the women politicians face turn to rape threats or death threats or something to do with their sex or gender in a very specific way? So this need for education needs to be intersectional and holistic in its understanding, and I really support what our colleagues were saying there, because it really is something that we need to understand, that it is a structure of society that we've had for millennia now that we need to do a systemic shift of and a systemic change, and it's going to be to the benefit of everyone. You know, women's rights isn't a women's issue, it's an issue for everyone, because we all benefit when everyone has equality. So I just really wanted to highlight what my colleagues were saying. Thanks,
Asha. Before I move back to the point that was brought up previously by you, MICHELA, on the Digital Services Act and in general EU legislation and the gender dimension, was there anything you would like to say on education before we shift the debate back slightly to current legislative proposals? Because otherwise we have a question from Ruth from the European Commission. She's Policy Office and Equality Coordinator, asking, I think it's a general question to all, perhaps some of you would like to reply. It's, I think, also popped up at the bottom. Do you think the impending EU Digital Services Act, I think it will be announced next week, next Wednesday, should have a specific gender dimension with obligations on online platforms to act proactively on gendered hate speech? MICHELA, if you would like to directly take that question, if others would like to join, don't hesitate.
I mean, as I was saying earlier, in the Digital Services Act, what we see is an opportunity to come up with the EU framework for content moderation, amongst other things. I don't know if the specific gender dimension fits into this horizontal instrument that the Commission has in mind. Probably the Commission is closer to what they have in mind specifically than I would be. I think that in general, in any case, the gender dimension needs to start being implemented in every piece of legislation. The importance of gendered hate speech, of the fight against gender-based hate speech is clear. And I think that also just an update of the framework decisions with regards to definitions of hate speech and illegal hate speech would help already in this sense to clarify. But yeah, my point would be that the more EU efforts in finding EU level definitions in the space would be very welcome from our perspective.
Mm-hmm. ASHA, I was wondering your thoughts on this, and do you think, I mean, now specifically the Digital Services Act, perhaps also SYLWIA, you have a view on this. I mean, it's a framework that is an economic one in some ways. Are we actually, is it able to address the right things that we're talking about here, or do we need to dig a bit deeper? Would it be too easy to say, look, just let's add the word gender in these kinds of proposals, but are we really addressing the core here? Yeah.
If I may, one of the key values of the European Union is equality between women and men. And we, of course, can focus on common agricultural policy as a fundamental value of the European Union. But if we just step back, we can see that we need to focus on gender equality and do just gender mainstreaming in every legislation piece we draft. So I can agree that we can add some elements, we can show some risks and the solutions also in such a legislation.
ASHA, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of gender mainstreaming or specifically the Digital Services Act?
Yes, we at the European Women's Lobby have been calling for this since our inception nearly 30 years ago, in the need to gender mainstream all EU policies, because equality between women and men and achieving gender equality is in the EU treaties. It's one of the founding principles. It's actually there that equality needs to be achieved, and unfortunately, as the recent report from the European Institute of Gender Equality shows, that we're moving at a snail's pace right now. If we continue to move at the pace that we're moving at, we're not going to achieve gender equality for at least another 60 years. On a European level, in some countries, it's going to be another century. So we would 100% agree that all policies need to be gender mainstreamed, and this includes looking at aspects such as gender budgeting. So, that means looking at budgets and how things are applied to ensure that it equally benefits everybody. On the Digital Services Act, I think you picked up the question there, Vanessa, in terms of how broad it is in scope, what it's going to aim to cover, and how concretely could we tackle the kind of complex issue of violence against women in this particular piece. We were pleased to see that, of course, harmful content and violence and possibly illegal content was being referenced in the public consultation process. But I think that the Digital Services Act has the opportunity to really include some very clear provisions, and that it needs to actually speak to other legislative frameworks, such as the Victims' Rights Directive, such as the Directive on Violence Against Women that we've been calling for, but the European Parliament has been calling for many, many years. And so we would also highlight that, again, not to miss this opportunity to our colleagues in the European Commission, because the aforementioned code of conduct on hate speech that was mentioned earlier doesn't mention sexist hate speech and doesn't mention women in it at all. So it's something that has been gravely missed. There is a very clear gender dimension to what's happening in the online space. And of course, for those who are experiencing multiple forms of discrimination, they need to be recognized, and it needs to be done through that holistic and theoretical intersectional analysis. But what we would say is that it can't be down to one piece. There needs to be harmonization, and we need to have the Digital Services Act address the gaps that already exist, and speak to the other forms of legislation that exist, so that we're not missing anything, so that everyone can experience the same level of protection from any form of online gender-based violence or illegal activity that is happening.
Thanks, ASHA. We still have a bit of time left, and there may be still more questions coming in from viewers. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on this particular point. Otherwise, I was still wondering about a few things. There's, for example, one point that I think we haven't touched upon. First of all, tech is also the tech industry is a very male-dominated industry. And obviously the content isn't coming from these platforms, but say, for example, the algorithms that are helping to detect harmful content is then generated through a specific way. And obviously we can maybe agree that this process, this technology can be improved. But I was wondering also the role of the whole structure of, the industry, and how we could maybe improve this, or at least address it, and from which angle would you address it? Perhaps MICHELA, but also if anyone else would like to.
Sure, I can come in. As a woman working in the tech industry, I of course can testify in the fact that it's a very male-dominated industry. I also am aware of the fact that Facebook and other companies as well are very involved in trying to get more women in tech. Again, I think it's also a matter of education. Again, I don't want to always say the same thing, but I think that there is an issue there at societal level with regards to to the kind of image that women have of themselves, and what kind of models they have, and what they believe they can do and they cannot do. So there, I think that the importance of raising awareness around the careers in STEM and broader in STEAM, or I can't remember what is the latest development in the space, but I think that that's very important in one sense. Of course, obviously, as I was mentioning, the importance of role models is also very much to be taken into consideration. And there, again, I think Facebook is trying to lead the way. We have a very outspoken and vocal women at the top, which is Sheryl Sandberg, and we have almost 50% of our board of directors, which is made of women. So we are far from having, I think, even close to 50% representation of women in the workforce, but we're definitely working in this space, in this sense. And then I think what you were mentioning, Vanessa, which I'd like to touch upon very briefly, on the bias with the algorithms. Of course, this is something that has come to our attention. We've also been speaking quite openly about the fact that we had registered not only bias against women, but also bias against people of color in the way that the algorithms were operating. But that's why we have implemented a new technical approach, which is trying to include fairness in the process of development of artificial intelligence. And we work together with leading researchers from the algorithmic fairness community in order to make sure to include best practices in the way that we operate and overcome the issue that is an existing one of bias in the algorithms.
Thanks, MICHELA. Another thought that sort of came to my mind is how you all spoke about education, but also awareness raising and the responsibility of all of us. But in some ways, if we push around the responsibility, we end up lacking concrete action. So I don't know, I was wondering also, Johanna, perhaps with your organization, and Lisa with your initiatives and your work with the European Movement Ireland, and ASHA with the European Women's Lobby, if you see a need to cooperate more amongst one another with social media platforms, with policymakers, because I don't know, there's, at least I perceive a very fast speed in which this is developing, you know, technology, but also the ways perpetrators use technology to attack women online. And then there's maybe a slower reaction from some, whether it's, you know, policymakers or social media platforms and online platforms. So in terms of responsibility, perhaps, how do you think we can address this better and work better together and share more of the responsibility without finger pointing and as a civil society organization?
Yeah, I think like you say, Vanessa, we need concrete actions and outputs and things like that. And we recently started to work with a LGBT magazine in Ireland to publish sort of, you know, how the EU works for LGBT people and the impacts of Brexit on LGBT people. You need these concrete, I think, collaborations and connections between organisations. Like I mentioned earlier, us working a bit with Facebook in Ireland just to be sure that, you know, we were working alongside each other on issues like this. I suppose when we talk about the engagement online and you know, something that I think we haven't mentioned that keeps coming to my head is that we need to be sort of understanding of what the definition of what a woman is and what we see as women, and that we understand ourselves as a community of women, and a really broad community of women. And we've talked a lot about intersectionality. We talked about, you know, women of different races and coming together, women across the member states, things like that. We also need to consider, and I know this can be a contentious issue for some, but it's something that's really important when we talk about equality and feminism, is, you know, trans women and non-binary people and how they fit into this discussion and how they're represented in our communications and in our workforces and things like that too. We've seen a lot of sort of online abuse of trans women in recent times and from women themselves, from cis women. And this is an issue because I think this fragments us and this separates us. And it's something that I know with my work with Shout Out that we're really working to support trans women and ensure that women are trans women are part of these debates and non-binary people too. Because otherwise, somebody made the point earlier, I think it could have been ASHA or JOHANNA, that when we don't work together, it's a problem, you know, when we fragment, when we separate. We need to be collaborative and be supportive of each other. So that was just something that sort of came to my mind when we talk about that kind of thing.
Good point. Thanks, Lisa. And I guess also, grasping the intersectional challenges, but at the same time encompassing everyone and not segmenting, as you say. Johanna, was there anything else that you wanted to add to this? Maybe also from a sort of Czech perspective, or how you perceive the cooperation among civil society? If there's any sort of also, I was wondering, best practices or maybe some sort of really good initiatives that we should be looking out for more, perhaps, that might have not been, you know, seen so far.
I think that in Czech Republic, the civil society is cooperating very well and supporting each other very often. Most of the women's rights organizations are under umbrella organization Czech Women's Lobby, which is was inspired by European Women's Lobby. But what I see is maybe missing the connections with another institutions. I can link it with the new phenomenon of violence, which was the Zoom bombing, which started with the COVID-19 crisis, as you remember. And to my organization happened that we were doing an online workshops for one school, and actually one student shared the link, and it was actually a workshop on prevention of sexual violence. And one of the students, he posted the link for the Zoom meeting on the Twitter, and at the beginning of the session, some strangers came inside and started to screen pornography, and they were like making noises. One of them was maybe even masturbating, we are not sure. But the thing is, why I'm explaining it, that it was at the time where already lots of people knew about the phenomenon of Zoom bombing, but and I know that one women's rights organization was working on it and discussing how could this be stopped, but there was no link with schools, for example, to inform them about how to what to do against it, and maybe just to set a rule that the students are not allowed to share the link somewhere else. So right now this case ended up that the students can't be punished because it was not forbidden to share the link. The police which I was dealing with is like doesn't know what to do about it, and it could be easily, I think it could be much easily prevented. But what I was trying to say that what we are missing is some proactivity and action to set up some new rules if there's a new phenomenon. It takes long. We knew about the Zoom bombing from the spring, I think, and it's still happening in the September or November. What is it?
Thanks, Johanna. Yeah, I mean, there's developments that are popping up and that we have to address quickly. And I'm also seeing some positive action also taken in some member states, in Germany and Austria. But yeah, in terms of sort of good solutions and best practices, I'm not sure, SYLWIA, if you also have any thoughts and maybe examples from Poland. If there's something that you also see in other member states, you know, you, in being a member of the European Parliament, you represent not only European women, but European citizens. So I think if there's maybe sort of something that you can see that that is missing, but also the sort of good approaches that you see perhaps in some member states that you would like to see at a European level, and including cooperation among civil society.
I can only add that as a lawyer, for me, the most important thing is to create the system that is legally binded, and the cooperation, networking, joint projects are very important, but without the system or at the level of the European Union, we cannot be efficient very much. And during my roundtable, we were discussing the issue in a group of people that were NGOs, representatives, activists, experts, and people from academia, because I think we need to raise the issue from very different perspectives. But you know, as a lawyer, I just can say that without a proper EU legislation, we can still we would need still fight cyber violence in a particular member state in a different way, because as European Women's Lobby has pointed out for many years, we need to have a common policies, common laws. You know, the implementation of the Victims Directive is so poor in member states of the European Union. So so we just need to, and this is my role as a politician now. We just need to unify the standards at EU level, and this is the most important for me solution to tackle the problem. Without the system, without the laws that oblige the platforms, law enforcement, representatives, police, prosecutors, judges, teachers, journalists, to do something. We cannot fight cyber violence against women efficiently.
Thanks, Sylwia. I see we have a few minutes left. And I would like to give these 5 minutes to you to share any final thoughts, if you want to respond to anything that has been said, and also maybe if there's one thing there were a lot of things said, obviously, and very good things said, and that gives me hope. But I think if there's something that you kind of feel that, you know, remains perhaps is not really resolved in your head for yourself, or you think, okay, that's something where we have to really look at it more or work together on this more. So if there's one point that you kind of feel came up from this discussion, feel free to highlight this now. And I was wondering, maybe MICHELA, you'd like to start, if that's okay with you, and then we'll sort of work our way around and we'll wrap up.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think that what SYLWIA, Dr. SPUREK was just saying was very interesting. I think that beyond the importance of clarifying the legal framework for the fight against gender-based cyber violence, I think that the need for an EU platform maybe to be created to bring together the different actors in the space is really important. We see other of course, other platforms that were created, like, for example, the European Internet Forum Against Counterterrorism, or other industry-led initiatives of this kind that bring together different people, that bring together industry, policymakers, law enforcement in some cases, of course, civil society organization, experts, academia, so that there can be an element of sharing best practices, of learning from each other, and then really finding concrete solutions to tackling the issue. I think that this would be really important. From our perspective, I was saying it at the very beginning, we've had only amazing experiences by collaborating with the different organizations. We have been able to launch features in the on our platform that help people seek help, that help people perfect their experience, or at least, you know, as I was saying again, establish boundaries that make them feel comfortable in their experience that they're having, or also launching altogether projects and pilots and tools, like there was a mention at the beginning of non-consensual intimate imagery sharing, which I think is a pity that we haven't been able to go a little bit more in details of, because there's so much that can be done there. There's so much that can be done to empowering women and empowering victims of this kind of abuse to be in control and do more to defend themselves and fight this terrible form of abuse of trust even. So I think my last message is just that it's kind of in line with everything else that I've been saying, which is that we're very committed to the collaborative effort, and we think that that's really the way to go in order to be able to fight and to solve. I believe that that's ultimately possible, and we will manage to solve the issue of gender-based violence online and offline.
Thanks, MICHELA. I would go next to Lisa. Lisa, are there any sort of points that you have forgotten to mention, or something that you would like to repeat, or that you think would be important that we continue the discussion on?
Yeah, I think representation of women across all sectors and across all levels of working life is hugely important, and I hope that the EU's gender equality strategy for 2020 to 2025 will support this. I think we've seen in the past where, you know, the journalism was dominated by men, then, you know, what we read in the newspapers was dominated by male issues, and we didn't hear about female issues. History is very sort of male centric, because for a long time historians and writers were predominantly men, and so we talk about policymakers, we talk about people working in IT, and, you know, you specified sort of on algorithms and things like that, Vanessa. I think basically we need women at all levels of society working in all of these different areas if we really want to work towards equality, and that will of course in turn help with these issues online. The issue is not the medium, it's not social media, it's not Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp. The issue is gender inequalities that still exist. And, you know, I looking back on this sort of history of this kind of thing, this was an issue. There were issues of gender inequality and abuse against women when the telegrams came out, and when sort of, you know, the first appearance of telephones. This is not a new issue. This is something that has a new medium that really has a lot of power to spread messages and to bring together people united in this kind of online abuse and hate. And so I think we need to tackle the issues at hand and equality in general in order to tackle these issues online. And we really do need more and more representation of women online, and or in all levels of society, in particular in policy making and politics. And in Ireland, I know there's great work being done by Women for Election to encourage women to get into politics and support them with these issues that come up, such as cyberbullying. And the National Women's Council supports women with similar issues, and Women on Air also supports women's voices on media in Ireland. So these are some examples of best practice from here in Ireland. And I think, yeah, representation is a big issue. And I think, as we've said time and time again, intersectionality in that representation going across the board is really important.
Thanks, Lisa. Johanna, any final words? We have a few more minutes left, or slightly.
I will just bring it back to the education mentioned, because I believe that we are still focused in schools on gaining informations, but I think in the new digital era we should more focus on the learning of important life skills and understanding of the world, and into that belongs to understand what the gender is, what are the gender stereotypes, how to combat them, and what the gender stereotypes or inequality is leading to, which is also the violence on women, which can happen online or offline. And I think there should be much more time dedicated to that kind of knowledge and to that kind of skills gaining in all our schools.
Same again, twice. Tap once more before we finish. I just wondered, Sylwia, if you have any final remarks, because you did one of the previous remarks, but if there's anything as a sort of final conclusion, and then I'd finish with ASHA and yeah. Otherwise, ASHA, you. Yep, feel free to go. Sylwia, yep.
Yes, you know, I was just thinking that, you know, in Poland, women won the right to vote 102 years ago. We just celebrated this on Saturday. So on one hand, we should not be surprised that we still talk about fundamental women's human rights, because it was not so many years ago. But on the other hand, if we don't want to talk about fundamental women's human rights for years, and I suppose we don't want to do it, we need to find very efficient solutions addressed to all actors of this process. And that's why we need a system. We need obligations of everybody who is responsible for or could be responsible for tackling this problem. So you can count on me here. Let me know if I could do here anything in the European Parliament. Just let me know.
Thank you, Sylwia. And that leaves ASHA for any final remarks, if you may have them. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'll be very, very brief, and I think that I just want to thank everyone on the panel for raising so many incredible points that we could, of course, talk a lot more about. But I think in terms of the final takeaways, I would really support the discussions that we've had on the need for legislation, on the need for these collective frameworks and mechanisms where we can come together and go further and say it then needs to turn into active, effective implementation on the ground. We need to be able to see those policies, that legislation, those mechanisms and the recommendations that come out of those mechanisms make a difference to the lives of women and girls across Europe and, of course, globally as well. But we're talking, of course, in the European context. And in order to support that, what we need is more data. violence against women and girls, both online and offline, is an area that is significantly lacking in data, and it's so essential that we have that on a comprehensive and uniform level. One example where we can see where that makes a difference, and just to go back to one of the questions that was mentioned before around women in STEAM and the examples there have been many tens of thousands of initiatives in increasing women's participation in these spaces, but it was vital data from 2018 that showed that unfortunately women in STEM careers or STEAM careers experience sexual harassment at a higher rate than any other profession except the military, that allowed some of those initiatives to shift and understand that it wasn't just about asking women to come into those spaces, but about the actual systemic shift and changing of those spaces in themselves to make sure that they were inclusive, so that people could come into them in a safe way. So this is why data is so essential. What we would also say is that, of course, that those actors who are involved, the platforms, the politicians, the institutions and civil societies, those efforts need to be sustained. Women's organizations need to be sustainably funded and effectively funded so that we can continue to bring those expertise, and those different mechanisms need to be supported and seen in a long-term perspective so that they can be maintained for generations of women and girls to come. And my last point is that now it's been so great having this conversation and having the diversity on the panel that we've had. And I think that now's the time for us to move beyond the conversations and see how we can implement solutions, see how we can develop those and see how we can implement them. It's much like we need to move beyond the narrative that we just have to accept that the online space is inherently violent. We don't accept that, and I don't think any of us here on this panel accept that either. So this would be our final call, and just to be clear that all women and girls deserve to live their lives free from all forms of violence, whether it's online or offline, and to live their life in peace and security. Thank you.
Thanks so much, ASHA, and thanks to all of you for joining, for your time, and for your really, really valuable thoughts and input on this. Really appreciate that you joined us, and I also hope that we can continue the discussion and also the actions, probably starting with ourselves first and the people around us. And I also want to maybe use this opportunity to say that tomorrow we have our 5th edition of the Women of Europe Awards, and we'd be delighted if you could join us. I know some of you already are involved, and I hope you have a really, really nice evening, and I look forward to seeing you in the future, hopefully perhaps in one day, not on a screen, even though this was great. And yeah, have a nice evening. Bye.